After Stalin's death, a triumvirate emerged on the political scene of the Soviet Union: Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Vyacheslav Molotov. But this apparent unity was only a thin crust covering a boiling cauldron of ambitions and fears. Each of them saw himself as the successor, but none had enough power to single-handedly take the place of the late leader. In this complex and dangerous game, where every move could cost lives, Nikita Khrushchev, then secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, became a key figure, the main initiator and organizer of the conspiracy against Lavrentiy Beria. Khrushchev, who had himself gone through the harsh years of purges and intrigues, understood well that in the struggle for power, the one who strikes first wins. He saw Beria, who was then in charge of the combined ministries of internal affairs and state security, as the main threat to the entire party leadership and to himself personally. It was no secret that Beria, with his enormous influence and control over the most powerful security apparatus in the country, could at any moment launch a new wave of repression, this time directed against his colleagues in the Presidium. This was not just political rivalry. It was a game of survival where not only positions but also lives were at stake. Khrushchev understood that he could not defeat such an opponent alone. He needed support, and he began to cautiously test the waters, looking for allies among those who also feared Beria. First, he turned to the military. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, a legendary commander, enjoyed enormous authority in the army and, importantly, had no sympathy for Beria, whose departments had repeatedly interfered in the affairs of the armed forces. Khrushchev managed to convince Zhukov and other senior military leaders that Beria posed an extreme danger to the party and the state. He painted a picture of a possible military coup or another wave of repression that could decapitate the army and the party. Perhaps Khrushchev reminded them of the fate of many military leaders who fell victim to repression in the 1930s, when Beria already played a significant role in the punitive apparatus. He spoke not only about political risks, but also about the personal safety of each of those present. After all, if Beria prevailed, who would vouch for their future? He used fear, the most powerful tool in politics at the time. It was not just persuasion, it was skillful work to create strategic alliances, where a common threat united even long-standing opponents. Thus, gradually, a coalition ready for action formed around Khrushchev. They understood that delay was tantamount to suicide. The tension grew with each passing day. Every member of the Presidium of the Central Committee, every minister, walking through the corridors of the Kremlin, felt the air thick with mistrust and hidden struggle. The 26th of June, 1953, was the day when this tension reached its peak. On that day, another meeting of the Presidium of the Council of Ministers of the USSR was scheduled to take place in the Kremlin building. Nothing seemed to foreshadow the dramatic events to come, except perhaps the unusual composure of some of the participants and the nervous anticipation that hung in the air. Lavrentiy Beria, accustomed to his power and position, arrived at the meeting as usual, confident in himself. He did not yet know that the trap was already closing. The operation to arrest him had been carefully planned and kept in the strictest secrecy. It was personally supervised by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The choice of a military leader for such a delicate mission was no accident. It was the army that had to counterbalance Beria's powerful security forces. The meeting proceeded as usual, with some issues being discussed, perhaps routine ones, perhaps already secondary for those who knew what was coming. And then, at some point, when Beria was probably saying something or listening attentively, Marshal Zhukov gave a coded signal. The office doors swung open, and several generals and officers entered. They were armed, which was completely unprecedented for a meeting of this level, and immediately emphasized the urgency of the moment. The suddenness of this intrusion was part of the plan. Beria, a man who had organized similar arrests himself and knew their psychology well, found himself in the role of victim. His personal security detail, which usually accompanied him everywhere, had been neutralized or removed in advance. The appearance of the military with weapons was not just a symbol of power. It was clear evidence that those who possessed real power beyond his control had turned against him. It was a moment when the pendulum of power swung in the other direction, and everyone present felt it. The drama of the moment was undeniable. For Beria, a man who had kept the entire country in fear for many years, it was the end of his absolute power. For the other members of the Presidium, it was a relief from the constant sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. The fear of Beria's security apparatus was so great that only such a decisive and sudden operation, carried out by the military, could guarantee success and avoid possible retaliation from his numerous supporters in the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of State Security. It was a turning point that marked the beginning of a new era. After Lavrentiy Beria's arrest, his former party colleagues were faced with the task of not only retaining power, but also legitimizing their actions in the eyes of both the Soviet people and the international community. The official motive for the arrest and subsequent trial was accusations of anti-party and anti-state activities aimed at usurping power. These formulations were carefully chosen to present Beria not simply as a political opponent, but as an enemy of the system, a man who was trying to undermine the foundations of the Soviet regime. Khrushchev and his associates, including Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, Nikolai Bulganin, and others, genuinely feared Beria. And their fears were well-founded. As head of the combined Ministry of Internal Affairs and Ministry of State Security, Beria wielded enormous power. He controlled not only the vast state security apparatus, which permeated all spheres of society, but also the internal troops, the border troops, and oversaw the atomic project. It was a force comparable to an entire army, and it was under his personal control. Constant anxiety gripped the members of the Presidium of the Central Committee. They remembered how Stalin, relying on the security apparatus, dealt with anyone who could challenge his power. Beria seemed to be following the same path. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ability to intrigue and eliminate those who were inconvenient. The idea that he could use his powerful security apparatus to seize power single-handedly, pushing aside the entire party nomenclature, was entirely realistic. Their fears were not limited to the loss of personal privileges or positions. They concerned the very principle of party rule. Beria, they believed, could completely change the rules of the game, turning the party into a puppet in the hands of the security forces. In this context, accusations of usurping power were not just a formality, but an expression of a deep existential fear of a man who, as they saw it, was ready to do anything to achieve his goals. After Lavrentiy Beria was put behind bars, the air in the Kremlin seemed to clear, but in reality it only thickened with new, as yet unspoken questions. After all, the arrest of such a powerful man as Beria could not have been a coincidence. It was the result of a long, intense confrontation, the roots of which went deep into the Stalin era, when Khrushchev and Beria, despite their outward camaraderie, were already rivals, albeit implicit ones. Their relationship had always been complicated. Khrushchev, as one of the key party officials, was responsible for ideology and agriculture, areas where direct violence was not such an obvious tool. Beria, on the contrary, was the embodiment of state terror, the chief architect of repression, a man who kept the whole country in fear, including his colleagues in the Politburo. He was the one who came on Stalin's orders to restore order, and his name evoked not just respect, but panic and terror. Khrushchev, like many others, remembered very well how Beria personally conducted interrogations, how cases were fabricated under his leadership, how people disappeared. This personal experience, the experience of living under constant threat, undoubtedly shaped Khrushchev's deep distrust and probably personal animosity towards the all-powerful head of the secret services. The doctor's case unfolded shortly before Stalin's death. At that time, a group of prominent doctors was accused of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. This case, like many others, was instigated by the MGB, and although Beria was not its direct initiator, he actively participated in its promotion. However, after Stalin's death, it was Beria who took the initiative to review the case, declaring it to be fabricated and securing the rehabilitation of the arrested doctors. This seemingly noble gesture was in fact part of his complex game. He sought to present himself as a new, more liberal leader, capable of correcting the mistakes of the past and thereby strengthening his popularity and influence. But for Khrushchev and others, this was only confirmation of his cynicism and willingness to change course to suit his own ambitions rather than true principles. They saw it not so much as a sincere desire for justice, but rather as a clever political move aimed at discrediting those who had previously supported the repressive line. It was precisely these reform initiatives of Beria, which at first might have seemed progressive, that actually became the catalyst for his downfall. He proposed de-Stalinization, but not in the way Khrushchev later carried it out, but rather as a way to distance himself from the most odious aspects of Stalin's regime in order to take the place of sole ruler himself. The end of the cult of personality sounded like an attempt to eliminate competitors rather than a sincere desire for democratization. The rehabilitation of the doctor's case was just the tip of the iceberg. Beria also initiated the review of many other cases, which, on the one hand, could bring relief to thousands of innocently convicted people, but on the other hand, sowed panic among those who fabricated these cases and those who benefited from Stalin's system. Many party officials, including Khrushchev, were deeply involved in the repressions and feared that Beria's next move would be directed against them. Who could guarantee that once he started the review, he would not get to their own skeletons in the closet? His proposals for liberalization in the GDR were even more radical and shocking to the party leadership. Beria, as is well known, advocated not building socialism in East Germany by force, but rather uniting the country under a neutral status. This would have meant relinquishing some of the Soviet Union's influence in Europe, acknowledging the failure of the socialist experiment in the GDR, and possibly setting a precedent for other Eastern Bloc countries. For Orthodox communists, this was tantamount to betraying the cause of the revolution and weakening the USSR's position in the Cold War. Similarly, his criticism of Russification in the Union republics and his proposals for a more flexible national policy, which he actively promoted, also caused a storm of indignation. During the Stalin years, a harsh policy of centralization and unification was pursued, with the Russian language and culture playing a dominant role. Beria's attempts to give more autonomy to national cadres and to end forced Russification were perceived as a threat to the unity of the Soviet Union. For the party nomenclature, accustomed to a rigid vertical power structure and unified national policy, these proposals were perceived as undermining the foundations of the state, capable of leading to separatism and weakening central authority. In the eyes of the party bigwigs, such steps were not only dangerous, but also demonstrated Beria's willingness to make any concessions to strengthen his influence, even if it meant revising the fundamental principles of Soviet national policy. The confrontation between Khrushchev and Beria remains an example of how personal ambitions and state interests intertwine in the whirlpool of history. The real reason probably lies in a gray area, not pure hatred or solely the salvation of the country, but a complex cocktail of fear, power, and ideology. Thank you for being with us, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to like.